Hello, good evening, and welcome to this evening's broadcast of Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof, I'm sure you welcome our viewers this evening for joining us again for another session.
Good evening. Hello. I'm happy to be back here with you, and I hope you are equally happy to see me. I'm looking forward to a good interaction.
Excellent. It's going to be an exciting time tonight because we are dealing with a topic that quite a lot of you have raised over the years, over the months, and even more importantly, more recently, it has become a topic that the younger generation have been asking questions about. Unfortunately, we have Professor Bolaji Akinyemi here, who is going to help us to break down some of these challenges that the younger generation may have as we look at some of the opportunities that existed when he was in government. And we also look at some of the other issues around the world. So this promises to be a very exciting evening. First, before we go into the questions, remember you can submit your questions on YouTube, on Facebook, and on Instagram. We can take all the questions that come in through those points. So it's going to be an exciting time. And Prof, before we go into the questions for tonight, we're looking at some of the questions that came back from last week. And one that has surfaced is how do you compare development and civilization? That is an interesting story that I think would serve as a good backdrop for this, Prof. I went to a restaurant here with the family, and we were served with some bowls that, if I had been served with that kind of bowl in Nigeria, in the village, as we would say, one would have looked at it and wondered, are we really sure this is a nice bowl? Are we sure it's decent? But it was a delicacy. So one starts to look at this and think, do we say we drop the use of some of these things that are local to us and that have been there for so many years and say, in the name of development, we want to move to something else? A very good example, Prof. Fork and knife. Something as simple as fork and knife. And you have the Japanese that are using their chopsticks and continue to use it, and the Chinese. So help us out, Prof. How do we navigate this thing?
Well, it's something we will have to deal with on an issue by issue basis. Um, Actually, the illustration you have raised, I was going to raise that in my answer. But some aspects of our tradition will still be applicable. It's still something that we can use now, while there are aspects of our tradition which we will have to drop. I'm sure there are aspects of Chinese or Japanese or Korean tradition or civilization which will be unacceptable now, even to them. So equally, there are aspects of our tradition and our civilization that, in a way, we also will have to drop, will not be compatible with the stage that we are in now. And examples of that will be there are people say, for the sake of religion, they cannot educate women. Now that will be unacceptable now, for the sake of measuring development even in those nations. There are those who will say you cannot educate, or for the sake of religion, you cannot send children to school. Now you will not be building a solid foundation for development for your society for the future. Therefore, that will not be acceptable. But for us to use our fingers to eat pounded yam, that I'm sure we can accommodate. Again, perhaps in some environments, surely you can't go to Buckingham Palace for Queen's dinner and start using your fingers. Just as I'm sure the Chinese will not go there and decide to use chopsticks. But no, development is development. There are now acceptable yardsticks laid down by the United Nations development programs in terms of infrastructural development, health development, educational development, not just for boys, but for the entire population. What percentage of women who should be taking part in governance? All of these are now development parameters which are globally accepted, and we cannot use the fact that traditionally women were not allowed to do this. Traditionally, children were not accepted to be educated. Traditionally, when a king dies, there were some traditional things which we would do in those days. You cannot now say you will do them now. This will not be acceptable. So really, it is an issue by issue, uh, an issue by issue processes that we will face and have to take a decision. But some will be rejected outright as being unacceptable in the 21st century.
Yeah, Prof. One thing I've looked at over the last 2, 3 months when it comes to the issue of development, which is actually quite interesting, is a number of governments that one would have said these were the developed nations. We suddenly started to find out that they were maybe not as developed as we would have wanted. Issues with the healthcare system. We started to see issues with technology infrastructure. A lot of companies and people were at home. Suddenly, phone systems were crashing. We've even had some countries that we called developed countries where we're having an increasing occurrence of power outages, things that maybe were not heard of in certain parts of the world. So we're starting to see this imbalance in development. Do you feel that some of these developmental goals have been things that painted certain communities in a better light?
But a very good question, and I like the way in which you have phrased it, or whoever sent in the question has phrased it, because it brings into our consciousness the fact that definition of development has actually become part of propaganda. Let's not beat about the bush. Those who control the media try to put a bold face on the positive aspects of their societies, while they tend to bring up the negative aspects of our societies. For example, until about 5 years ago, when the journalists that used to be sent to Africa were citizens of Western societies, when they are filing their reports, they will go to our local markets with open drainages behind them, and that's what they will use as the prop to file their reports. Whereas when they are filing their reports in either London or New York, they will go to Bond Street or Wall Street and use those as backprops. It is when we started to complain, and when we complained, we were told we were trying to interfere with press freedom. But it was when we accused them of racism, point blank, that they now started sending in African correspondents, and they were now using props that showed our development, that we had moved away from the stage of village development. We were now running positive sides of urban development. What we have got to get into our mind, and the illustrations that you have thrown up, is that there is no nation that does not have development that probably has left behind 50% of its population. 50% in terms of they are living below the poverty line, that they are not getting health. They don't have access to health facilities. They don't have access to insurance facilities, which was what led to Obamacare in the United States. And even with Obamacare, there is still up to 40%, if not more, of Americans who have no access to medical insurance. So, to that extent, it's a question of percentages, but that there is a society that has fully absorbed 100% its population in terms of development, that is a misnomer. That is just propaganda. Every society, whether the United States or Britain or France or China or Japan, they still have a huge chunk of their population who are below the poverty line and who still have no access to clean water, to electricity, to even telecommunication facilities. It is not only Africa or the third world that suffer from those developmental insufficiencies.
I think that when we look at, I was in the US sometime last year, and as we drove through some of the areas, I could see some of the rundown buildings. I won't mention exactly where, so they don't say we're trying to run down a particular area. But the buildings were run down. The infrastructure looked like all just dilapidated all over the place. And I was wondering, this is interesting. This is the United States. You expect that things would be working, but alas, not quite what we thought it was going to be. So, in the African context, then, Prof, do we need to do a lot more to start to sell the good that is coming out of Africa?
We need to, and that is the fault of our government. Let's not blame anybody for it. When I was a minister, I took to President Babangida a proposal to to employ foreign agencies, what's the word I'm looking for now? Um, Public relations firms that we will use as consultants. And I ran into opposition from my fellow cabinet members, especially those who were in the information ministry, who felt that no, they should send out officers from their ministry to go to our embassies abroad, and that they will not be able to sell our programs or sell our societies to where they will be posted. And I said, no, this is wrong. You send from here an information officer to our embassy in Washington. Did he go to school with the editor of the Washington Post? Did he go to school editor at CNN or NBC or CBS? You send an information officer to London. Could he pick up the phone and speak directly to the editor of The Observer or The Times or The Guardian? No. Whereas public relations firms, their officers probably went to the same school as these people. They play golf together. They belong to the same societies. They could just pick up the phone and say, I have a story for you on Nigeria, a good story. And the guy just says, okay, send it along. And that is how you get good publicity for your country. But as I said, unfortunately, I couldn't get I couldn't get the government at that time to accept what I was saying, and this is one of the negative aspects of misplaced nationalism. As far as I'm concerned, it was just a waste of money posting abroad these information officers who had no access to the foreign newspapers or the foreign media where you need to sell yourself. So I would still maintain that it is still the time to do so. Let us face it. Getting a story onto CNN where it is watched by millions pays you more than putting a story on your own local television station, even if it has outlets abroad. Question of credibility. You see a story on CNN, on BBC World Service, the target audience, which is the Western audience, will give it more credibility than if they see it on one of our own national television stations, but with access abroad. So we need not only to sell the positive aspects of our own development, we need to pick the agencies that we will use to do so. So the fault is in us, in addition, of course, to having to face what I would still call the racial bias of Western journalists.
One thing interesting in what you said there, which I think we should point out, Prof, is your desire to use some of these other outlets is not necessarily because you are downplaying what we have, but what you're saying is that they reach an audience that we don't reach at the moment. in terms of some of the channels that we have. And that's the important driver. Because I see someone might hear what you said there and say, well, we want to use our local organizations, we want to support our local bodies. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say, I'm as nationalistic as the next person. But would that achieve our objectives, which is to reach a large audience as possible about our positive development? And the answer would be no, because you wouldn't. Or our local, no matter how excellent is the report, no matter how excellent is the technical expertise, you will not be able to, unless, as I said, you went to Oxford with the British Prime Minister or with the British Foreign Minister, you play golf with him, the head of the BBC, you belong to the same club, and therefore you could pick up the phone and reach him. Until you could do that, you just be wasting money in terms of your investment, and you will not be achieving the objectives that you want to achieve. Face it, question of credibility. Who will believe you more? Is it the person watching a Nigerian correspondent filing a report from the NTA, or a British correspondent filing for the BBC?
I
Whom
think
would
that
they
is
believe more?
powerful. I think that is powerful, Prof. Because a lot of times this emotional sentiment takes over. But what you're talking about there is being results driven. What do we
Yes.
want? What is the outcome we're after? Do whatever is necessary to achieve that outcome, but still maintain your goal. The more people know about what's happening, the more they are likely to come and see. And that in itself starts to grow that industry, grows tourism. Some of the places that we have gone to on holiday, we saw nice pictures in catalogs. There's an interesting story I have here. A while ago, we went to Spain and with the family. This is interesting, Proof. And we picked up the manual that we had, the catalog we had in the room. And one of the attractions was that there was somewhere close by where we could go and watch goats. So my wife called me and said, let's go and watch goats. I said, me, I come from Nigeria, in the village of Nigeria. I go to Spain and it's goats you want me to go and watch. I said, no, 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 that's not going to work. But the point here is this. For them, they put the nice, attractive pictures that attracted us to go in there in the first place. Then we get there, they show us the rest of the environment. And we need to think about that in that African context. Now, moving on to the next topic, Prof, and this is a very critical one, which we've started to touch on in a bit, and this is this issue of the younger generation and this debate on whether Africa and Nigeria specifically, whether there is a generation that we have lost. And of recent, I'll see if I can bring that up from the system here. Of recent, there is a picture that has been making the rounds over the internet. It's gone viral. And it's gone viral for a very interesting reason. Let's see if we can get that up. Yeah, there we go. There we go. This picture has gone viral. But before we even go into much detail, do you want to talk to us about this occasion? What was happening here?
Where did you get that picture from? That picture was taken in 1975. Where did you get it from?
Someone sent it to me on the internet. I got a WhatsApp message or someone sent it this picture to me.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, but I'm really, goodness me. Oh well, wow. Um, um, uh, yes, I remember when this picture was taken. Now that I'm focusing on it, um, the head of state then, newly appointed, General Murtala Mohammed, had come to the institute, and the institute was being used as the venue to inaugurate a new constitutional drafting committee that has been set up to come up with the draft of a new constitution for Nigeria that will
Yeah.
address the issues which the new regime believed Nigeria was faced with. And since they were using the institute as a venue, and I was the chief executive of the institute, I had to welcome him and take him to the premises that will be the particular hall that will be used. Of course, I mean, one can talk about it now. This is some 40 years ago. I had an input into some of the ideas that he was going to use. So I was not just a passive attendant on the occasion. So that's when that picture was taken. And when you look at it now, we were about the same generation. I don't quite remember. I think I was 33 years old, and General Mohammed was probably 36, about 3 years older. So we were in the 30ish generation when this picture was taken.
And Prof, that is the challenge that is being raised. That this was you at 33. And at this time, you already had your doctorate degrees. How come you had such an opportunity? And it seems that a lot of the African leaders we're seeing today are the old guys with the white hair. They're not doing the kind of mentoring you are doing through programs like this. They are still the ones who want to be in power. They're still the ones who want to be in authority. How do we get the 33, the 36, 37, 38-year olds into such positions that you had?
Well, we must be careful about generalization. There is no doubt that what you've just described is a phenomenon in some countries in the world, not just African countries. For example, President Trump is, I think, 76 or 77. Joe Biden, who is going to be his competitor, is even older by a year. I think he's 78. And yet, Jefferson was 36 when he signed the Declaration of American Independence document. But there were also people who were in their 40s and some people who were in their 50s. The United States had John F. Kennedy, who was, I think, 45 when he was president. And yet you've had Ronald Reagan in his 70s. Now you've had, the 70s are competing now. You will have to vote for them in November. In some African countries, you have people who are in their 70s and even some who are in their 80s. So it's a global phenomenon. And I think you just have to look at it in terms of curve-wise. Now there are somewhere in their 70s. Who knows? 10 years down the line, you may have people who are in their 40s who may be competing to be president. In 1999, if we can localize this issue, several people who became governors in 1999 in Nigeria were in their 30s. I wouldn't want to mention names, but at least I could reel up the name of 6 governors who were in their 30s. And of those, 3 competed or declared their intention to be president after General Obasanjo left office. Of course, they didn't make it. Not that they were blocked legally or constitutionally. They met all the parameters to be president, but their party processes and their party system, they couldn't get through to become candidates to run for office. In the last election in Nigeria, you know this as well as I do. Again, I wouldn't want to mention names, but there were about 10 candidates who were in their 30s and early 40s. And there were attempts to get them together so that they can step down for just one of them to run for office. They refused to cooperate. All of them decided that they were going to run. It was an ego trip because at the end of the day, people were getting 20,000 votes, while President Buhari was getting 6 million votes. Some of them were getting 100,000 votes, while President President Jonathan was getting 5-point-something million votes. Now, that if you are going to be that ego-driven and selfish, there's no way 10 people are going to defeat one man, no matter how old that man is. So, part of the fault is with the younger generation. You must be strategic in your planning. You must be strategic in your involvement in the political process. You just can't come up 6 months before the election and declare that you are forming a political party and that you are going to run to be president. You haven't run to be chairman of a local government. You haven't run to be governor. You haven't you haven't been a minister, but you just come up and say, I'm running for the presidency. You're not going to make it. In our generation, it was because the system was driven by the military. I am sure if when I was in my 30s, there were political parties, I don't think I would have made it because they will be looking for a party loyalist who has money to give them, who has money to get supporters before you can then start appointing them ministers, appointing them this, appointing them that. But because it was a military regime, it was the decision of, in a way, one man, and that was the head of state, who was looking for people who will help him to sell his program. But when you are dealing with a civilian system, You are not looking for somebody who is going to help you run your system. You are rewarding people who helped you to win the election, whether they understand your agenda or not. Possession of money comes into it rather than people with ideas to have around them.
Well, so something you said there, Prof. Again, just still looking at this picture. This challenge of ego that you mentioned, surely that thing existed during your time. It's not new that people have this sort of ego trip. Everybody wants to be the leader, nobody wants to collaborate. Everybody just feels that if I cannot be leader, no one else can be the leader. You must have had those kind of challenges during your time.
Well, this uh, probably, but the thing is, a military man, a military head of state, already has such self-confidence that he's not worried about the capability and the intelligence of the people he's about to appoint to office. I was when I became a minister under President Babangida. President Babangida was so knowledgeable. He has such self-confidence that, in fact, he welcomed people with ideas around him. Now, you don't get that, I must say, in a political party-driven civilian regime. Often, where it's not the brightest and the best who become president in a democracy, unfortunately. I mean, as you can see, all over the world, not just in Nigeria. But to that extent, the people you then appoint as your advisors, as your cabinet ministers, as we have seen in the United States, are not the brightest and the best. In fact, I think I can only think of two presidents, maybe slightly wrong, maybe three, who who surrounded themselves with the brightest and the best. At least the two I'm sure of were John F. Kennedy and Barack Obama, because they themselves, I mean, Barack Obama was Harvard educated. John F. Kennedy was Harvard educated. He could, outthink you. They were people who welcomed people with ideas, with intelligence around them. Not President Trump, who seems to be afraid of his own shadows, not to talk about, welcoming people with bright ideas around him. So it's the same thing with some of the African regimes. They don't want young people with ideas around them. They are more comfortable with their godfathers and so on, who promoted them into office.
You know something
But
interesting
let me
here,
say this.
Prof. And I'm sure that
Sorry, sorry, Mr. Moderator, before we go off. Of course, there are risks that were run by people under the military regime. Yes, I ended up being minister. I could have ended up being in jail because I was also very critical of military regimes and ideas that I disagreed with. Now, how many of the young ones are prepared to take that risk? Chief Gani Fawehinmi took that risk. Beko Ransom Kuti took that risk, and they ended up in prison, in detention. And some will say that's what contributed to their early death. So don't let us get it at that. If you are an activist under the military, you end up being minister. you could also end up being in jail.
Yes, yes. But something that's coming out quite clear in some of the things you're pointing to here is the level of education was different. Again, at this stage, in this picture we're looking at, you already had your doctorate degrees from foreign organizations. You were very enlightened. But for a lot of the people coming up and the younger ones, the motivation is not coming from a point of I've been educated, I'm going out here to make change because change is right. A lot of people want to get there because it's your opportunity to your big break. When you were at this stage in this picture, did you see this as your big break?
Yes, I did, because I was being given an opportunity to see whether I could walk that talk. I was already an activist intellectually as a university lecturer. And before I became a minister, I had become a professor. Those were my goals in life. In your generation, the goal seems to be to make money, to be successful as an entrepreneur, to be successful as a businessman. That seems to be the goal of your generation. And now, did the goals differ because of the opportunities that were available? Maybe yes. But objectives, you have to be focused on your objectives. If you want to be an activist or you want to be a politician, if you want to be a politician, then you play their game. But as I again said, in 1999, at least 6 or so of our governors were in their 30s, and they could easily have become president after Obasanjo. But the political system did not allow them to be. But the opportunities were there.
So, what is your, and in fact, before I actually go to that point, obviously, at the, at the risk of ageism, attacks, and things like that, let's put that to one side. Do you think that having people in their 30s, 40s, or so is an indication of rapid advancement within that economy? For you, it worked because you were highly educated. But were you an exception?
Um, well, exception in what sense?
In the sense that you seem to have gone through a trajectory that was education, further education, even more education. Then you got the opportunity, and you gradually moved up the ladder, if I can explain it that way. But did you have a lot of people in other government organizations like the one you were in that were about the same age as you?
Yes, some were. But a better example would be when I was a minister. In the cabinet were KIK, Kalu Idika Kalu, who came from the World Bank, about the same age. He might have been 1 or 2 years older than me. There was Chu Okongo, who became Minister of Finance, who again, we were around about the same age. There was Professor Olikoye Ransom Kuti, much older, but came from the university, background. There was Tam David West, who was Minister of Petroleum at one time. who was about 5 years older. And then there were people from the military who were again also about the same age. So there was that opportunity, and the opportunity was for people who had made you know who were achievers in their areas of professionalism, rather than is recommended by my godfather, is my party man, he's my this is my no. They were looking for people who were professionals and who were achievers in their areas, and then were being given opportunities to now practicalize what they had been preaching, and they made the success of it.
Yeah.
Professor
There's
Luke
a question here, Prof,
yes.
that says you talked about people who paid a price for activism by going to jail, and the question here is that did they end up in jail because they were wrong, or did they end up in jail because the system was compromised?
No, they ended up in jail because the system saw them, or those who ran the system saw them as threats to them. Let me say this. If Murtala's coup in 1975 had not taken place, the Gawan regime would probably have detained me. There were enough indications that those of us who were loud activists towards the tail end of the Gawan regime were perceived by the Gawan regime as a threat to that regime, and probably we would have been dealt with. But we were then just lucky. So at times, circumstances and luck and hard work combine to promote.
So, what would you
The
say to
Gawan
the younger
regime
generation of today?
will be prepared to be involved. Be prepared to be involved, and not wait until it is election time and then you go and form a political party with 5 or 10 people and declare political platform on the pages of the newspaper when you don't have grassroots support, when you haven't planted the seeds. Be prepared to take risks, and then maybe you will make it.
Wow. Wow. So, this is interesting, because I'm looking at the story of Joe Biden here. Joe Biden was appointed a senator at the age of 29. I think he was sworn in when he was about 30 or thereabout. And he's still in government today, working his way up, got to vice president. Now he's going for presidency. So what you're describing there is actually a trajectory that some of us in this generation need to start to adopt. Start to do something relevant where you are, and let that relevance bring you to the place of recognition. That seems to be what helped you. You were already being relevant before you got these breaks you were talking about.
Yes, I got the break because I was prepared to take risks as an activist. There were my colleagues in the university who never left the university system until they retired at the age of 70. They didn't want to come out of that cocoon. Some of them were actually very critical of me as an activist thinking I was running a risk. Others said, look, they just want to be university teachers. That's all. There were also others who came back with the same kind of degrees and then went to the private sector. That was their own trajectory. So, and they stayed there. They became managing director, especially those who were in the technical field, in Shell, in BP, in Texaco, in the oil industry. A lot of people of my generation, whom we were in the United States together, went into the oil industry and made it there. So I decided that I was going to be an intellectual activist, and it paid off. But it could easily
Have backfired.
have backfired.
Wow. Wow. Now that one, you have left me speechless. Because I'm just thinking about this in my mind, and I'm saying that this is one area where maybe a lot of us may have missed it. That area of intellectual activism, maybe we're missing. Everybody just thinks it's about the noise. If you make enough noise, then it gets you recognized. But no, it's making intelligent noise. And what you're also saying here is that some people went into different sectors, like we're starting to see now, because I see a younger generation who are responding from going into agriculture. They're responding from going into technology. People are building technological hubs that will help as a form of activism, a form of saying that we can make it even if we have all these challenges around the government. And this leads to one of the questions that we have here, sir. That when we start to look at how we pivot this thing about development, to what degree do we rely on the government being responsible for driving this development? And because I think of some of the younger people don't want to take training on business development. People don't want to take training on the basics of running a business, the basics of diversifying, the basics of building your intellectual capacity. People don't want to do all those kind of things. So, to what degree would you say this is a government thing, and this is just the fundamental basics of development?
It's a question of which type of model do you adopt. In a lot of developing countries, and quite rightly, the government is the engine of development in terms of laying down the parameters of how the development in the country will run, who will police it, and who will ensure that the objectives set are followed, and who will ensure that rules of engagement are followed. Whether it is done Lee Kuan Yew style in Singapore, whether it's being done by the Chinese, or whether it's a kind of a free-for-all. But you need to be careful. What looks like a free-for-all capitalism, like practiced in the United States, is in fact a very thoroughly organized and policed system. If you know the number of organizations or institutions that the United States government puts in place to monitor, to police, to regulate participation by the private sector in development, you will be amazed. You will indeed be amazed. So, in the developing countries, you often need government to even protect the domestic development from, if you like, a negative type of intervention from abroad. Because intervention from abroad could be exploitative.
Mm.
They could come in with things that you don't even need. And that's happened a lot in African countries when Indians, Lebanese, and what have you have come in with nothing but empty bags, empty portmanteau, and then within 3 or 4 years, they have become the millionaires driving the engine of development and getting the money out. Government has to be in place and put in institutions that will prevent that kind of exploitation. Put in place institutions that will actually encourage your own people, the domestic participation in the system. You must have that. So to that extent, government is there, but it's got to be a positive type of government, not a negative type that will team up with foreigners to actually exploit its own people. But there is no way that the role of government in development that you can do without it. It is something that is necessary, whether in a developed country to police or in a developing country to set the parameters of development. But it needs participation by people who know what they are talking about. And this is where your younger generation comes in, because you are very well educated, you know what development is all about, you've been exposed externally to the system abroad, and you probably have been able to sift out what will be of what you need to use positively in your own country. Your government must support you rather than fight against you.
Wow. Prof, this has been fantastic. Unfortunately, as always on this event, we have to get to the end and we run out of time. But the good news is we'll be back next week. And there's some of the topics and some more questions that we're going to have to put to you as we continue to explore this concept of leadership, development, democracy, looking at the younger generation and how they can be mentored by people like you who have been there, who have gone through the kind of challenges they have gone through. You've got your scars from the battles you fought, and they can learn from these things. So, again, thank you to our viewers. Thank you for the questions, the comments. We really appreciate that. And we'll be back here again next week, same time, 7 p.m. BST. And again, it promises to be a fantastic time. Thank you very much, Prof, for tonight. We look forward to next week.
Thank you very much. And to our viewers, I welcome your questions. There are no questions that I regard as antagonistic. Ask them. I'll answer them. Thank you.
Fantastic.